Her name was Nora Hicks. She lived in a two-room house outside Boise City, Oklahoma. The year was 1934. The dust had killed the wheat. The bank had taken the neighbor's land. Her husband hadn't found a paying day's work in 11 weeks. She had 4 children, a sack of dried beans, a half-empty flour bin, and $3.40 folded inside the cover of a Bible. She did not leave. She did not ask for help. She opened the flour bin and started doing what her mother had taught her and what her mother's mother had carried out of harder times still. She had a system, not a budget, not a plan written in a bank pamphlet, a system of habits built for surviving what money cannot fix. Between 1930 and 1940, the Great Plains lost more than 2 million people to migration. The ones who stayed, the ones who held on while the sky turned black and the soil blew into drifts against the fence posts, they did not survive on luck. They survived on a set of tricks so practical, so brutally efficient that most of them have been completely forgotten in the 80 years since. Number 8 on this list kept an entire family fed for 3 weeks on what most people today would throw away on a Thursday evening. Number 14 saved the house when the mortgage came due and there was nothing in the account. And number 1, the rule these families held above every other, is the same principle now printed in financial books that sell for $30 a copy. They learned it when $1 was the difference between eating and not. These are not nostalgic curiosities. They are a survival manual from the people who outlasted the worst economic and environmental disaster in American history. Not the ones who left, the ones who stayed and made it through. Hit subscribe. Let's count down the 25 forgotten money tricks the Dust Bowl families used to survive America's hardest years. Before a single dollar was spent on food preservation, there was the ground itself. Dust Bowl families dug root cellars, some no larger than a walk-in closet, and used the Earth's constant temperature to keep food through summer heat and winter freeze alike. Turnips, potatoes, carrots, cabbage, and apples went in during harvest and came back out in February, firm enough to eat. A family that stored properly could eat from a cellar for 4 to 5 months without spending a cent. The cost was a weekend of digging and a few planks of wood for the door. The payoff was surviving February without a grocery run. The ground kept no ledger and charged no interest. It was the first bank these families ever trusted. When flour came in printed cotton sacks, and during the Depression it always did, nothing was wasted. Mothers washed the sacks, cut them open flat, and stitched them into children's dresses, aprons, pillowcases, and underwear. The mill companies eventually caught on and began printing the fabric in flowers and stripes, specifically because they knew what women were doing with them. 3 flour sacks made a dress, 5 made a set of curtains, a dozen pieced together made a quilt. Not a quilt for decoration, a quilt for January. The children wore them to school, they wore them to church. A child in a flour sack dress was not a child in poverty. She was a child whose mother had not wasted a single yard of material the world had sent her way. Nothing with nutritional value left the kitchen. Nothing. When a chicken was butchered, the carcass went into a pot with water and whatever scraps of vegetable were on hand. Onion skins, celery tops, carrot ends. The pot simmered for hours on the back of the stove. What came out was broth dense enough to gel when it cooled. That broth became soup. The soup stretched with dried beans or barley. A single chicken carcass that cost nothing, it had already given its meat, fed a family of 5 2 more suppers. In the Dust Bowl years, the phrase wasted food did not exist. If it had come into the house, it left only as something a body had used. Cash was nearly gone from the rural plains economy by 1934. What replaced it was barter, and the most valuable thing a man or woman could offer was a day's labor. Farmers traded half a day of fence mending for a bushel of potatoes. Women exchanged a week of laundry for a side of pork. Children pulled weeds in a neighbor's garden in exchange for a jar of their honey. No money changed hands. No record was kept. The obligation was honored because in a world without cash, a man's word was the only currency left that had not lost its value. A family that could offer skilled work, carpentry, sewing, midwifery, butchering, rarely went to bed hungry, even in the worst years. The exchange rate was set by need and agreed by handshake. It held. Butter was expensive and went rancid without refrigeration. Lard was neither. Rendered from hog fat at slaughter time, it kept for months in a covered tin and cost nothing beyond the labor of rendering it. It greased the pan, made the biscuit tender, waterproofed leather boots, and, in the worst cases, went on bread alone as a meal. Lard carried a family through mornings when there was nothing else to fry. A biscuit with lard was 400 calories of fuel that cost pennies. It was not a delicacy, it was engineering. Families who kept hogs kept eating. The hog was not a pet. The hog was a savings account that walked on 4 legs and required nothing but scraps to run. Sunday dinner in a Dust Bowl household was not a luxury. It was a calculation. One large pot of stew or soup, whatever vegetables the cellar held, a small amount of meat or bone, dried beans, and water, fed everyone at the table and left enough for Monday's lunch. The pot went back on the stove with added water and whatever was at hand. By Tuesday, it was soup again. A family of 6 could eat 3 meals from a single cooking effort and a single fire. Fuel, whether wood, coal, or dried cow dung, which many families used, was not free. Every time the stove lit, it cost something. The pot that kept going cost the least. The Sunday pot was not laziness. It was the most efficient use of heat, time, and food a family could manage. On the Great Plains, money and weather were the same thing. A man who could read approaching weather, who knew the difference between a rain cloud and a dust cloud, who could feel the air pressure drop on his forearms, could make decisions that saved his crop and his season. He planted when others waited. He harvested 3 days early. He moved the animals before the storm arrived. This sounds like farming knowledge. It was also financial knowledge. Losing a crop to a storm that could have been partially harvested was the same as losing cash. The families who paid attention to the sky lost less. They did not have meteorology. They had 40 years of watching, passed down in conversation over supper. That was worth more than any newspaper forecast. Buying seeds every spring was a cost that could be eliminated entirely. Dust Bowl families saved seeds from every harvest. The best tomatoes, the hardiest beans, the squash that had survived the dry August. Dried them, labeled them in whatever jars were available, and sealed them through winter. Come spring, the seed money stayed in the pocket. Over a generation, a family's saved seeds became something more. A library of plants adapted specifically to their soil and their climate. Seeds bought from a catalog had never felt that particular patch of Oklahoma hardpan. Seeds saved from last year had survived it. The jar on the windowsill was not storage. It was next year's harvest waiting. A garment was not finished when it wore through. It was finished when there was nothing left to salvage. A shirt that frayed at the collar was turned. The collar flipped and restitched, so the worn edge was hidden and the fresh edge showed. Trousers with a blown-out knee were patched with fabric from a garment too far gone to patch. When the patch itself wore through, the fabric became rags, and the rags became stuffing, and the stuffing became insulation. Nothing left the house in recognizable form. The life of a garment was measured in years of wearing, then years of repurposing, and it ended as something unrecognizable from what it started as. The family that never bought new clothing, not for a full year, sometimes 2, was not poor. It was prepared. Cash that could be seen could be spent, or worse, borrowed against. The women who kept families solvent through the Depression years often kept a reserve that their husbands did not know the exact size of. Not through dishonesty, through wisdom. A man who knew there were $12 in the Bible might spend 3 of them on something that felt necessary. A man who believed there were 8 would not. The money was hidden in books, in the lining of coat pockets, in tins behind the stove, not because the husband was untrustworthy, because emergencies did not announce themselves, and a reserve that no one felt was available was a reserve that survived. When the roof needed a new section of tar paper, the money appeared. He thought she was clever. She was a financial architect who had simply never told him the blueprints. A refrigerator was not a given. A canning jar required lids that cost money. But the sun and the dry plains air cost nothing at all. Apples sliced thin and threaded on string. Beans spread on a sheet of tin and left in the afternoon heat. Chilies tied in bunches and hung from the porch rafters. Corn cut from the cob and dried on screens. Dried food weighed almost nothing, took up almost no space, and lasted through a winter without spoiling. A summer's surplus of tomatoes could become a winter of dried slices that reconstituted in soup. A good apple harvest, dried in September, was pies in December. The plains air that stole the moisture from the topsoil was the same air that preserved the food. They used the very thing that was destroying them to survive. A broken tool was not a new purchase, it was a repair job. Farm equipment, leather harnesses, wagon wheels, boots, hand tools, everything was maintained and mended before replacement was even considered. A man who knew how to work leather, sharpen metal, and splice rope was a man whose family's equipment lasted twice as long as it should have. The repair was done on a Sunday because Sunday was the day there was light and no fieldwork pressing. The skills were taught to the children the same afternoon. A boy who knew how to patch a harness before he turned 12 was a boy who would not spend money on a saddler for the next 50 years. The tool that lasted 20 years instead of 10 had the same value as earning double the money. The savings were invisible. They were enormous. Water cost effort. Every gallon carried from a well or a cistern represented minutes of labor, and those minutes had a value. Dust Bowl families used water with a precision that seems almost unimaginable today. Wash water from the morning was carried outside to the garden. Cooking water was reused. Nothing was poured out that could serve another purpose. When water became genuinely scarce, and in the worst drought years it did, families prioritized it the way a general prioritizes ammunition. Drinking came first. Animals came second. The garden came third. The washing waited. A family that managed its water managed its survival. There was no category of thrift more fundamental to life on the plains than treating water as something that could run out, because it could, and sometimes it did. The ones who stayed did not have more money. They had better systems. The tricks in this list were not born of creativity. They were born of a condition in which every single dollar had to do 3 jobs before it was allowed to rest. The government sent pamphlets, farmers, and children to pull beans and fetch water. The pamphlets did not feed anyone. The beans did. Dust Bowl families who lived near a town cultivated a specific relationship with the butcher. Not for steaks, for soup bones. The cuts nobody else wanted, the neck, the shank, the knuckle, the marrow bone, were sold cheaply and sometimes given away entirely. A family that was known to the butcher, that came in reliably and was polite and asked for the right things, often received a bag of bones for a few pennies or for nothing. The bones went into the pot and became 3 days of broth. The marrow went onto toast. The small scraps of meat that came free during cooking went into whatever was simmering. A soup bone that cost 10 cents fed a family 4 times. They were not ashamed to ask for the bones. Shame was an expense they could not afford. Anyone who took an afternoon to learn could do it and save money. Soap was not purchased. Soap was made. The process required 2 things: rendered fat, the grease left over from cooking, saved in a tin for weeks, and lye, which could be made by leaching water through wood ash. Combine them in the right proportion, cook them correctly, and the result was a hard, effective soap that cleaned everything from hands to floors to laundry. A single batch cost almost nothing. The fat was a byproduct of cooking that would otherwise have been discarded. The ash came from the stove that was burning anyway. The labor was an afternoon. A family that made its own soap did not buy soap for years. The skill has almost entirely disappeared. The savings were real and recurring, and they belonged to anyone who took an afternoon to learn. When a hog was butchered, and most families butchered once a year in late November, when the cold could preserve the meat, nothing was discarded. The hams were salted and smoked, the bacon and side pork were cured. The head became head cheese. The liver went into the pan that evening. The intestines were cleaned for sausage casing. The feet were pickled. The fat was rendered into lard. The scraps, too small for anything else, were ground and seasoned and stuffed back into the casings as sausage. One animal, slaughtered on a Saturday, provided protein for a family of 5 for 3 months. Not one cut, the whole animal, used completely, a transformation so thorough that by spring there was almost nothing left that had not passed through someone's body as fuel. They did not eat every part of the animal because they were desperate. They ate every part because wasting it was an insult to everything the year had cost them. When money ran short, and it did, Dust Bowl families did not go to the bank. Banks had failed. They went to the neighbor. Not for charity, for a loan of specific material value. A sack of flour to be returned at harvest, a jar of lard to be replaced at butchering time, seed corn to be paid back at double after the first good crop. The terms were spoken, not written. The repayment was tracked in memory, not paper. And the relationship required to make such a loan possible was built over years of showing up, helping with the harvest, bringing food when a child was sick, being someone whose word was a contract without a signature. This was not the informal economy of poverty. It was a sophisticated credit system that ran without interest because the currency was trust, and the trust had been earned before anyone needed to spend it. A child on a Dust Bowl farm was not a dependent. From about the age of 6, a child contributed measurably to the family's survival, gathering eggs, pulling weeds, fetching water, minding the younger children so a mother could take in washing, picking cotton for a neighbor's family in exchange for food. The labor of children was not a footnote to the family economy. It was a line item. This was not exploitation. It was reality. A family of 5 that could field the labor of 3 working-age children had a workforce. The skills those children learned, how to preserve food, how to manage animals, how to stretch $1 into a week, remained with them for life. Many of them would say, decades later, that those years were the most useful education they ever received. The child who learned at 10 to make something from nothing grew into an adult who was never afraid of a hard year. In communities where the general store was 20 miles away and the gas for a truck cost money, the traveling trader was a lifeline. He came through every few weeks with a wagon of dry goods, fabric, seeds, and tools, and he was willing to trade for whatever the farm had produced: eggs, butter, dried beans, a piece of farm equipment not currently needed. The families who knew how to trade, who understood the value of what they had and did not undersell it, got better terms. A woman who knew that her rendered lard was worth more to the trader than he let on could press for an extra spool of thread. The transaction was always a negotiation. The prepared negotiator always came out ahead. Money was almost irrelevant. What moved was value, in whatever physical form it happened to take that season. Every August and September, the Dust Bowl kitchen became a factory. Whatever the garden had produced, and even in drought years, a well-managed garden produced something, went into mason jars in a canning marathon that lasted days. Tomatoes, green beans, corn, peaches, pears, pickles, fruit preserves. The work started at dawn and ran until the last jar was sealed. A family that canned 200 jars in September had 200 meals already paid for before October began. The jars sat on the cellar shelves and were drawn down through winter and spring, one meal at a time. The math was simple. A jar of home-canned tomatoes cost the price of the seed and the labor of a summer afternoon. A tin of store-bought tomatoes cost cash the family may or may not have had. 200 jars meant 200 times the family did not need the store. That was not a hobby. That was a budget strategy with a lid and a rubber seal. The families who survived the Depression best were not the ones who spent the least. They were the ones who knew most precisely what they could not produce themselves and spent their money only on those things: salt, baking soda, kerosene for the lamp, a new blade when the old one would no longer sharpen, coffee, sometimes in small quantities, as the one luxury that kept a man's spirit from going gray as the sky. Everything else, the food, the clothing, the soap, the entertainment, came from the family's own labor and the land's own yield. Cash left the house for the irreplaceable. Everything that could be replaced with effort stayed in the pocket. This was not deprivation. It was a philosophy. The family that bought nothing it could make was a family that was never fully at the mercy of a price it could not control. This was the rule above all rules. The family that survived the Dust Bowl years on the plains was almost always the family that lived on what the previous year had produced and kept the current year's income untouched for as long as humanly possible. When the wheat came in, if it came in, the money went first to the cellar, the seed jar, and the account that paid the mortgage. Not to new shoes, not to a debt owed around town, not to anything that could be delayed. The present year's income was for the future. The present year's living came from the past. It sounds simple. It is the hardest financial discipline a human being can practice because it requires behaving as though the money in your hand does not belong to you yet, as though it is already spoken for by a version of yourself who will need it more desperately in 6 months. The families who held to this rule looked to the outside world as though they were barely scraping by. From the inside, they were building an invisible wall between themselves and catastrophe. When the next bad year came, and it always came, they were standing behind it. The families who had spent this year's money this year were not. She kept the ledger by the lamp. She tallied what they had eaten against what they had stored. She knew to the jar and the dollar where they stood. He brought in what the land and the labor produced. She decided what that was worth. Together, they did not just survive America's hardest years, they built a family that could outlast them. These 25 tricks were not the secrets of the desperate. They were the discipline of the prepared. They did not require education or credit or luck. They required attention, the willingness to look a hard season directly in the face and say, "Not yet. Not this family. Not today." The Dust Bowl lasted a decade. The families who held on lasted longer. And the habits they built in those years, the seed jar, the bone pot, the hidden reserve, the knowledge that spending last year's money is the only safe way to spend any money at all, did not disappear when the rain finally came back. They were carried forward in the hands of children who had learned, young, that a dollar kept is worth $3 spent. We called those habits old-fashioned when the good years arrived. We are paying the price for that opinion now. If you found something useful,